With so much taking place as of late involving jail and prison escapes, researching those stories to share with you has taken me down some pretty interesting rabbit holes, especially about certain states and their prison systems and even certain prisons. Some of these things that I'm uncovering about how prison used to be back in the 1960s and 70s is even shocking for me, and things that I had no idea about. If you think that prison is bad now, just wait till you hear about these 5 facts involving how it was back then. And if it was this bad back then, well, just imagine how bad it was even before the 1960s. The information I'm getting ready to share with you is mostly from 2 prisons I'm just recently learning about, both of which are in the state of Arkansas and both of which are still operational to this very day. These have got to be some of the worst prisons that I have ever heard about. A place called Tucker State Prison Farm and Cummins Unit, both, again, located in the state of Arkansas. And with that, let's go ahead and begin with fact 1, prisoner trustees. You know, this is a term that we've talked about many times before here on After Prison Show, and a term that you're probably somewhat familiar with yourself, especially if you've served time. When you think about a prisoner trustee nowadays, what comes to mind is probably the likes of a prisoner kitchen worker or maybe somebody working down in laundry. But did you know that prisoner trustees have been around since the 1800s? And back in the day, these trustees were nothing like what they are today. In fact, back around the 1960s, these prisoner trustees were actually entrusted to watch over, essentially guard, the prisoner population, especially prisoner workers out in fields and farms. These prisoner trustees were given these positions because even back then, decades ago, prisons dealt with staffing shortages, just like they do today. But what it seems the prisons probably came to realize back during this time was that it was certainly more cost effective than to worry about hiring and having to put on salary actual prison staff and guards. It was a lot cheaper to just have the prisoners police each other. I think back to the last prison that I served time at, a place called Indian Creek, and while there, they had what was referred to as cadres. This was a program prison, and these prisoner cadres were essentially like inmate police. They watched over you. If you did something wrong, they would write you a ticket for it. And this is something that is so frowned upon in the prison system these days. You think about snitching and being the police, like nobody wants to do that. But back during the 1960s and 70s, in places like Arkansas and other states as well, like Mississippi and Alabama and a lot of states down in the South, the best that you could expect to do, being at one of these particular prisons like Tucker State Prison Farm or Cummins Unit in Arkansas, the best that you could hope to do would be to become one of these prisoner police, a prisoner trustee. Fact 2. Keeping that same energy in relation to prisoner trustees, and quite possibly one of the biggest revelations that I was shocked to learn about, and maybe you will be as well. These prisoner trustees were not just entrusted to watch over and police the rest of the prisoner population. These guys were armed with knives and guns. Folks, I share with you right here a picture that I ran across of these actual inmate trustees armed with rifles and bullet belts. I mean, look at these guys. And these guys were absolutely nothing to take lightly. I ran across information that says the highest in the prison inmate hierarchy were the inmates armed with rifles, called the trustee shooters. Back during the 1960s and 70s, and even earlier before that, there wasn't a lot of information that came out in regards to what was taking place inside of these prisons. It wouldn't be until the 1960s when a guy named Tom Morton would actually get involved with the Arkansas Department of Corrections, coming from Alaska, where he had just helped to create the Department of Corrections there and get things rocking and rolling and running smoothly. Then he comes to Arkansas and he sees absolute pandemonium, chaos, horrendous, horror-like conditions which he would attempt to expose. And that would actually cause quite a bit of turmoil in his own particular life. He would be fired from the job that he had in Arkansas, helping with the prisons there. He would attempt to try to write a book that would see minimal success. He would end up getting divorced from his wife because he was unemployed and he was just down bad. And it wouldn't be until years later where he would actually begin to bounce back, getting a job working as a professor in a college. But to think, had it not been for this guy, Tom Morton, these conditions would have, one, never been exposed, and two, probably would not have had the change taking place that would end up beginning because of this guy essentially putting his entire life on the line, trying to see some type of reform begin to take place. They say Morton had helped establish the correctional system in the new state of Alaska during the 1960s, and he was hired to reform the Arkansas prison system in 1968. He wrote about his experiences there in a book called Accomplices to the Crime, the Arkansas Prison Scandal. When I tried to find this book, because I would love to read this thing is almost $200 on Amazon. After he wrote that book, though, he was unable to find work in the correctional industry, undoubtedly, given the fact that he had just exposed everything that was taking place in Arkansas. And all that he exposed is a lot of what we're sharing here. In his later writings about the Tucker State Prison Farm in Arkansas, Morton noted the cruelty of the trustees. Discipline was routinely enforced by flogging, beating with clubs, inserting of needles under fingernails. This is what the trustees were doing to the other prisoners. And crushing of testicles with pliers. Just imagine being locked up back during this time. There was nobody that you could run to for help. There was nothing that you could do. The prisoners ran the prison, and these guys had freaking guns. Fact number 3, speaking of what they were doing with that pair of pliers, torture is also something that I never really thought about taking place as much as it was in prisons back during this time. Not only was it the prisoners armed with guns and knives and pliers and needles who were torturing prisoners, but it was also the little staff that they did have at these particular prisons that were doing just that as well. In 1968, Tom Morton alleged that 3 human skeletons found on the farm at Cummins Unit were the remains of inmates who had been subjected to torture. When this guy Tom Morton alleged this, it prompted a publicized investigation which found a prison hospital served as a torture chamber and a doctor as chief tormentor through use of devices such as what was deemed the Tucker telephone. Folks, take a look at this picture right here of this old telephone. I wouldn't even know how to use this, but this telephone device was turned into a torture machine for prisoners. The revelations included allegations of electrical devices connected to the genitalia of inmates. The Arkansas State Penitentiary System at the time had already been found to have held inmates at the Cummins Unit under conditions rising to the levels of unconstitutionally cruel and unusual punishment. And to speak more about this Tucker telephone, this was a torture device designed using parts from a crank telephone. The electric generator of the telephone is wired in sequence to 2 dry cell batteries so that the instrument can be used to administer electrical shocks to a person. The Tucker telephone was invented by A.E. Rollins, a resident physician at the Tucker State Prison Farm in Arkansas in the 1960s. We talk so much nowadays about filling out a sick call slip and them just administering Tylenol for every ailment. Back in the 60s, the physicians at the prisons, they weren't even there to help you. They were there to torture and do experiments on you. We've made mention in the past of the black box that was allegedly created by a prisoner serving time who was actually killed for creating that black box. I'm not sure if there's any truth to that or if that's just an old prison urban legend, but the black box in question is what goes over the handcuffs so that you couldn't pick the lock. It's a lock over locks on the handcuffs. We think that's so bad. At this particular prison back in the 1960s, they were creating torture devices and experimenting with the likes of that on prisoners. At the Tucker State Prison Farm, an inmate would be taken to the hospital room where he was most likely restrained to an examining table, and 2 wires would be applied to the prisoner. The ground wire was wrapped around the big toe, and the hot wire would be applied to the other toe. The torture device was also used on the genitalia. The crank of the phone would then be turned and an electrical current would shoot into the prisoner's body. Often, the victim would experience detrimental effects, mainly mental health problems, and this thing was used until 1968. Again, keep in mind, this thing was created in like 1960. So for almost 10 years, they were using the likes of this thing in Arkansas, and possibly also in other states as well. Fact number 4. Mass graves uncovered of unidentified prisoners. Let's go back to Tom Morton when he uncovered these 3 skeletal remains at Cummins Unit. They say in early February 1968, Morton ordered excavations on the grounds of the Cummins Prison Farm. 3 bodies were uncovered before the excavation was halted by prison officials at this time, who were trying to cover this entire thing up. The reason why Tom Morton ordered this excavation is because back during this time, this man had an inmate informant by the name of Reuben Johnson. I've tried to find a picture of this guy. There's none that can be found. It's crazy to think that you had inmate informants decades ago, just like you do today. But the information this inmate informant shared with this guy, Tom Morton, was horrific. Although 15 to 25 depressions were clearly visible when they uncovered the 3 skeletal remains, they could see 15 to 25 other areas where there were probably bodies at as well. Morton's inmate informant told him that as many as 200 bodies had been buried there. The number of prisoners listed as escapees since 1915 was reported as more than 200. The inmate informant told him there was like 200 bodies buried right here. The prison shut down this excavation after he uncovered 3 bodies. And from the year 1915, the prison had listed over 200 escapees. The same exact number the inmate informant said were buried in this mass unidentified grave. According to the informant, Reuben Johnson, most of the men had been killed after refusing extortion demands from the trustees. Not only would these guys kill you because they were armed to do so, these prisoners who were just prisoners like you were, except they had guns. They probably felt godlike in there. The extortion, the criminal activity that was taking place on the inside was undoubtedly worse than anything that was going on outside of a prison back during this time. According to the informant, Reuben Johnson, most of the men had been killed after refusing extortion demands from the trustee guards. Their deaths were either falsely recorded as successful escapes or recorded as deaths but under different pretenses. Johnson, a lifer, gave details of murders and burials on the prison grounds dating back for decades, including a mass murder of about 20 inmates around Labor Day of 1940. I'd love to learn more about that particular story. Johnson was backed up by at least one other inmate, James Wilson. Wilson also asserted that returning escapees were routinely murdered. There's one final fact that I want to share with you in this, and this one is just as unbelievable as these things that we've learned about thus far. You know, back during the 1960s and 70s in places like Arkansas and deep in the South, you know, prison labor was essentially slave labor. You weren't paid to do so. You were worked as hard as possible for 6 days out of the week, 10 hours a day. If they felt like you weren't working hard enough, they beat you. And you weren't paid for this. But even back during the 1960s and 70s, they still had a commissary. And the way that I have just uncovered, prisoners would actually get money to be able to go to the commissary sometimes, at least if you were healthy enough, was to sell their blood. Prisoners did not receive payment for working in the fields. In order to buy items from the commissary, some prisoners worked there. Other prisoners sold their blood. A healthy prisoner was permitted to sell his blood once weekly. Couldn't even imagine having to do something like that just to get some snacks or basic provisions. You hear about these type of conditions, these type of things, barbaric, horrific environments that prison life and culture was decades ago. In comparison to the way that it is these days, it is an absolute cakewalk nowadays. And back during these horrific times, escapes were even more common. And why wouldn't they be, given the alternative of staying in a place like what these prisons were like to live out these horrendous conditions? The risk back then was certainly worth the reward, because what's the worst they were going to do to you? Kill you. And I guess even that, especially back then, was certainly worth the risk. Folks, that's all that I've got with this video. I hope that you found some interest in this. And if you did so, please leave a like and a comment letting me know exactly what you thought about any or everything that we've shared here today. If you find yourself here on After Prison Show enjoying this content but not yet subscribed, please consider doing so and turning on bell notifications so that you never miss an upload from us. It would certainly be appreciated and go a long ways to helping to support this channel. As always, until next time, enjoy life, the free world, never take a moment for granted, and make the most of every day. Peace!